Daniel Cross had always believed in following rules. It was, after all, part of his job as a diplomat. But at that moment, standing inside the sacred chamber of the Valetheran Palace, he realized he had just broken a very important one. The air was thick with an unfamiliar scent, something metallic and sweet. The walls glowed with a soft blue hue, pulsing as if they were alive. Strange symbols floated midair, forming patterns he didn't understand. And right in the center of the room stood her, Princess Sena. She was unlike any alien he had seen before, tall, elegant, and dressed in what looked like thin, flowing silk that shimmered under the dim light. Her deep violet eyes widened in shock and disbelief as she stared at him. It was clear he wasn't supposed to be here. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, Sena's expression changed. Confusion turned into anger. "Human, how dare you enter the sacred chamber?" Her voice was sharp, commanding. Daniel held up his hands in surrender. "Wait, it's a mistake. I didn't mean to intrude." But the damage was done. The alien guards outside heard the commotion. Within seconds, 3 of them rushed inside, their weapons raised. They were twice Daniel's size, their armor gleaming with energy shields. One wrong move, and he knew they wouldn't hesitate to strike. Sena's gaze flickered between Daniel and the guards. There was something off about the situation. A human shouldn't have been able to enter this place, not without permission. The chamber was sealed with ancient energy barriers. Yet, he was here, unharmed, unaffected. Her heart pounded. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Lower your weapons," she ordered, though her voice was tight. The guards hesitated but obeyed. Daniel swallowed hard. "Look, I was told to wait outside, but the door just opened. I thought it was my escort. I didn't mean to." Zena's eyes narrowed. If the door had opened for him, it meant only one thing. The ritual had acknowledged his presence. That was impossible. No human could interfere with the choosing. Unless. She stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "You have no idea what you've done, do you?" Daniel frowned. "I just walked in. That's all." Sena took a deep breath. "No, human. That is not all. You have just broken a law older than your entire species." A deep silence followed her words. Daniel's stomach twisted. What had he just gotten himself into? The arena was quiet as Daniel stepped out of the dark corridor, his heart still racing from the final trial. He had passed the path of shadows, the hardest challenge yet, and now, for the first time since he'd arrived on Valetheran, he felt like he might actually have a chance at freedom. The crowd erupted in applause, but Daniel's eyes were locked on the figure standing high above him on the balcony. Princess Sena. Her gaze was steady, but there was something else in her eyes now. Something like respect. But as the applause died down, Sena's voice rang out across the arena, sharp and cold. "Human, you have completed the trials." Daniel straightened, trying to shake off the exhaustion. He had been through so much. All the trials. The strength, the combat, the mind games. He had survived them all. But as Sena continued, a strange feeling of unease settled in the pit of his stomach. "But you have only done part of what is required," she said, her voice calm yet chilling. "The bond between us is not over. There is one more step." Daniel's brow furrowed. One more step. Before Sena could answer, a series of loud footsteps echoed through the arena. Daniel turned, his eyes widening as a group of Valetheran soldiers marched in, their faces cold and their weapons drawn. Xena's expression remained unreadable. "You are a threat to our people," she said softly, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "The bond has to be completed, by force." Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Betrayal. He had survived all the trials only to be handed over to the very soldiers he had been fighting against. You can't be serious," Daniel whispered, the shock in his voice clear. "I earned my place here. I've proven myself." Xena didn't look at him directly. She just gave a small nod to the soldiers. The soldiers moved forward, their eyes trained on Daniel, their weapons raised. But Daniel, despite the shock, couldn't bring himself to panic. He had faced the toughest challenges in the arena. He wasn't going to let them take him now. "I won't fight for you," Daniel said, his voice firm. "I won't be your pawn." Zaina's eyes narrowed. "You have no choice. The bond must be completed. It's a law older than your kind." The soldiers circled him, weapons at the ready. "You are to be bound to me," Zaina repeated, as if the words held some kind of power. Daniel could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had no weapons, no allies, and yet he wasn't afraid. He had fought for his life, for his freedom, and he wouldn't give up now. With one sudden move, Daniel lunged at the nearest soldier, using his legs to trip the massive alien and knock him to the ground. He grabbed the soldier's weapon, twisting it from his grasp, and pointed it toward the other soldiers. The crowd gasped in shock. But Zaina just stood there, her expression unreadable. "You will regret this, human," she said softly, though there was no anger in her voice. Daniel's heart pounded. He knew he couldn't win against the entire group. But there was one thing he had learned from the trials: never give up. In a moment of clarity, he made a decision. If Zaina truly believed he would be forced to stay, he had to change the rules of the game. "I don't want your bond," Daniel said, his voice steady. "I'll leave. I'll leave your world, but only on my terms." The soldiers hesitated, confused by his defiance. And that moment of hesitation was all Daniel needed. With one last glance at Zaina, Daniel ran. Daniel stood in the arena, his pulse racing. The Valtheran warrior was advancing toward him, and the weight of the situation settled in. This was it. His first real trial, and failure wasn't an option. The warrior's glowing blue markings shimmered as he gripped his blade, his eyes cold and calculating. Daniel couldn't let himself freeze up now. He had to think. He had to survive. The first thing he noticed was the distance between them. The warrior was fast, too fast for Daniel to just stand there and wait for an attack. He needed to act first, to control the fight. As the warrior raised his blade, ready to strike, Daniel dashed to the left, moving as quickly as he could. The warrior's weapon slashed through the air, narrowly missing Daniel's side. The movement was so fast it almost blurred, but Daniel had expected that. He had seen warriors like this before, and he knew that one mistake could cost him his life. He ducked low and rolled, coming to his feet behind a large stone pillar in the center of the arena. The warrior turned and followed, but Daniel was already a step ahead. Think, think, think. Daniel's mind raced as the warrior advanced. He wasn't going to beat him with strength, that much was clear. But he could use the environment. The pillars in the arena offered cover, but they also offered something else: height. As the warrior reached him, Daniel dashed to the right again, leading him to the other side of the arena. He needed to get to the nearest pillar. Once there, he had an idea. If he could climb it and get above his opponent, he might have a chance. The warrior followed, his steps heavy, but Daniel was faster. He grabbed the stone surface of the pillar and started to climb, every muscle in his arms burning with effort. The warrior roared in frustration, slamming his blade into the pillar, narrowly missing Daniel's feet. But Daniel didn't stop. He kept climbing. When he finally reached the top, he paused, looking down at the warrior. The alien looked up, his eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to his prey escaping. Daniel, his heart pounding, tried to steady his breathing. This was his chance. From this height, he could see everything. He could see the warrior's movements, his intentions, and he could strike first. With a deep breath, Daniel jumped, aiming for the warrior's back. He landed on him, using his momentum to knock the alien off balance. The warrior stumbled, and Daniel quickly scrambled to his feet. He had the advantage. The warrior snarled and swung his blade, but Daniel dodged again, staying just out of reach. This was his moment. He had to finish it. Using the warrior's own weight against him, Daniel grabbed the alien's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground. The crowd around the arena gasped, but Daniel didn't hear them. He only heard the warrior's struggle beneath him, the blade falling from his grip. With one final, sharp twist, Daniel pinned the alien to the ground, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He had done it. The arena fell silent. For a moment, Daniel thought he had failed. But then, the crowd erupted into cheering. Xana's voice rang out from above. The human survives the first trial. Daniel could barely believe it. He had survived. But he knew this was only the beginning. There were more trials ahead, and the next one might be even more dangerous. As he stood, wiping sweat from his brow, he could feel Xana's eyes on him. Her gaze was no longer filled with doubt. There was something else there now. Respect. But for Daniel, respect didn't mean much if he didn't survive the next trial. The shuttle plummeted toward the planet's surface, the rush of air against the hull deafening as Daniel gripped the controls tightly. Behind him, the Valtheran warship was in hot pursuit, its cannons lighting up the dark sky with bursts of deadly energy. Daniel's heart raced, but his focus never wavered. He had no choice now. The self-destruct sequence was ticking down, the countdown flashing ominously on the shuttle's dashboard. He had activated it the moment he entered the asteroid field, hoping it would be enough to throw off the warship's pursuit. It wasn't just his escape, it was his final stand. As the shuttle continued its dive, Daniel's thoughts went back to everything that had led him here. He had come to Valthera as a diplomat, never expecting to be forced into trials, to be bound by a strange alien law, or to find himself at war with an empire. And Xana. He still couldn't fully understand why she had betrayed him, why she had chosen the empire over him. Maybe it was the laws of her people, or maybe it was fear, but none of that mattered now. He was done fighting for someone else's cause. The warship fired again, but this time, Daniel was ready. He maneuvered the shuttle to avoid the blast, diving lower, deeper into the atmosphere. The warship followed, but its massive size made it harder to keep up with Daniel's smaller, more agile shuttle. The planet's surface grew closer, the landscape below a blur of green and brown. Daniel could see the city of Valthera below him, the towering structures reaching toward the sky. But he wasn't heading for the city. He aimed the shuttle at the dense forest that lay beyond, where he would have a chance to land safely. The warship fired once more, but this time, Daniel didn't dodge. Instead, he aimed the shuttle directly at the heart of the massive ship. The countdown was nearing its end. There was no turning back. Goodbye, he muttered under his breath, knowing that this was his final chance to escape. The shuttle's engines roared as the ship accelerated, and he braced himself for the impact. At the last moment, the warship tried to break off, but it was too late. The shuttle collided with the side of the warship with a deafening explosion. For a moment, there was nothing but fire and chaos. The explosion rocked the entire area, sending shockwaves through the sky. The warship began to fall, its engines igniting as it lost control. And then there was silence. Daniel awoke to the feeling of dirt beneath him, his body sore from the impact but still alive. The shuttle's systems had failed, but it had protected him, slowing the crash just enough to save his life. The warship, however, had not been so fortunate. He crawled out of the wreckage, gasping for air. The forest around him was silent, peaceful even, as if the planet itself was welcoming him. He had made it. He had survived. In the distance, the remnants of the warship burned brightly, a signal to anyone who would come searching for him. But Daniel didn't care. He wasn't running anymore. A figure approached from behind. Xana. She stood there, her expression unreadable as she looked down at him. Her clothes were torn, and her face was streaked with dirt. Daniel stood up, dusting himself off. So, it's over then. Xana didn't speak at first. She just watched him, her violet eyes searching his face as if trying to understand him. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. No, it's not over, human. The trials are over, but the bond we share still exists. And I need to know something. Daniel took a step toward her, a quiet defiance in his stance. What is it? Zaina took a deep breath, then finally said, Do you truly want to be free, or do you want to stay? Daniel didn't hesitate. He had fought for his freedom, for his right to choose his own path. I want to be free, he said, his voice firm. Zaina nodded slowly, her face softening. She reached out a hand, and Daniel shook it firmly. Then you are free, she said. For the first time since arriving on Valthera, Daniel felt like he was finally in control of his own destiny. The empire, the trials, the bond, it all faded into the past. And as the two of them stood there, amidst the wreckage, Daniel knew that this was only the beginning of a new journey. A journey he would choose. Daniel's body was bruised, his muscles sore from the previous trials. But as he stood in the center of the arena, the final trial loomed before him. His heart beat heavily in his chest. He had survived the first two trials, but the third, the Path of Shadows, was said to be the most dangerous of them all. The crowd fell silent as the large stone doors at the far side of the arena creaked open, revealing a dark corridor that stretched deep into the ground. The air was cold, and the faint sound of whispering winds echoed from within. Zaina's voice cut through the silence. The Path of Shadows will test your mind, your spirit, and your will. Only those who are truly worthy will survive. Daniel swallowed, trying to steady his nerves. This was it, the final test. He couldn't back down now. Do not fear the shadows, human. Fear what hides within them. Zaina's words were ominous, but there was something else there, a sense of curiosity, as though she was waiting to see if Daniel could truly rise to the challenge. Taking a deep breath, Daniel stepped into the darkness of the corridor. The moment he crossed the threshold, the heavy doors slammed shut behind him with a deafening clang. He was alone. The path was narrow, the walls slick with moisture, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. Daniel's footsteps echoed, loud in the silence. He strained his ears, listening for anything, but there was nothing, just the sound of his own breathing. Suddenly, the floor beneath him shifted, and the ground seemed to open up. Daniel barely managed to catch himself as he stumbled forward, realizing that the corridor was changing beneath his feet. The path was alive, constantly shifting, forcing him to stay on guard. He gritted his teeth. This was no ordinary trial. Every step he took felt like walking through a maze, twisting and turning with no clear way forward. The shadows seemed to shift and swirl around him, making it impossible to trust his senses. He couldn't even see his own hand in front of his face. Stay focused, Daniel muttered to himself. Stay calm. Don't let the shadows fool you. He moved forward, carefully, feeling the walls for guidance. Suddenly, he heard something, a soft whisper, barely audible. His heart skipped a beat. He wasn't alone. The whispering grew louder, circling him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The shadows seemed to pulse, and Daniel felt a strange pressure building in the air. The whispers weren't just noises. They were voices. Daniel shook his head, trying to clear the fear that was creeping into his mind. This was part of the trial. The voices were meant to disorient him, to make him question his own mind, but he had to push through. He had to keep moving. A shape flickered in the corner of his vision. His heart raced, but he forced himself to stay still. Slowly, the figure emerged from the shadows. A tall, faceless figure, cloaked in darkness. You must face me, the figure whispered, its voice low and deep. Only then can you continue. Daniel's muscles tensed. This was it, the final test. But he knew something the figure didn't. He was human, and humans were good at thinking their way out of problems. With a sharp move, Daniel grabbed a loose rock from the ground and hurled it toward the figure. The moment it hit the ground, the figure dissolved into the shadows, fading away as if it had never been there. The whispers stopped, the shadows lifted, and the path began to straighten. Daniel breathed a sigh of relief. He had passed the trial. But as he stepped forward, he felt a presence. Xena was watching him. From above, Xena's voice rang out, clear and loud. You have passed the path of shadows. You are worthy, human. Daniel looked up, feeling a strange sense of pride. He had done it. He had survived the trials. But this was only the beginning. The bond between him and Xena was still unbroken, and their journey was far from over. Daniel could feel the weight of Princess Xena's gaze. Her violet eyes were sharp, piercing through him like a blade. The alien guards stood around him, tense and ready, their hands gripping their weapons tightly. The air in the sacred chamber felt heavy. He had clearly made a mistake, a big one. Xena's voice was controlled but cold. Human, do you understand what you have done? Daniel swallowed. I told you, it was a mistake. The door opened, so I thought. Xena cut him off. That door does not open for outsiders. It only responds to those who are chosen. Daniel frowned. Chosen for what? The princess didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step closer, studying him carefully. There was no fear in his eyes, no sign of deception. He truly had no idea what he had done. Her jaw tightened. The choosing is an ancient ritual. It decides who is worthy to stand beside the royal bloodline. Daniel blinked. You mean, like a marriage ritual? Xena's expression darkened. Not exactly. But in many ways, yes. Daniel felt his stomach drop. This had to be a joke. He had been sent here as a diplomat to discuss trade, not to accidentally get engaged to an alien princess. He let out a nervous laugh. Okay, look, there's clearly a misunderstanding. I didn't come here for this ritual. Maybe the door malfunctioned. One of the guards hissed, offended by his words. Xena's face remained unreadable, but her fingers curled into fists. The ritual does not malfunction. The chamber itself has decided that you are part of it now. Daniel took a step back. Wait. So what happens now? The guards exchanged glances. One of them muttered something in the Vile-Theran language. Xena exhaled sharply. Now, the council will decide if you live or die. Daniel froze. His mind raced. Die, just for stepping into the wrong room. This was insane. But one look at the guards, their expressions serious, told him that she wasn't bluffing. Xena turned to her guards. Take him to the holding chamber. No harm is to come to him. Yet. The guards grabbed Daniel's arms, but he didn't struggle. Fighting would only make things worse. As they dragged him away, he glanced back at Xena. For a brief second, he thought he saw something in her expression. Uncertainty. Doubt. Maybe she didn't want him to die either. But that didn't mean she would save him. For now, all he could do was wait, and hope he got out of this alive. The next day arrived faster than Daniel had expected. The early morning light filtered through the small window of his holding room, casting strange shadows on the walls. He had barely slept, his mind racing through the events of the previous day. What did it mean to be bound to an alien princess? What kind of trials would he face? The uncertainty gnawed at him. He wasn't sure what to think about Xena. On one hand, she seemed almost sympathetic, but on the other, she was the one who had just told him he could be her property forever if he failed. Just as his thoughts started to drift again, the heavy door to his room opened. A guard stepped in, followed by Xena. Her expression was calm, but there was something in the air between them, a tension that couldn't be ignored. She looked at him for a moment, her violet eyes studying him as though weighing his very soul. It's time, human, she said, her voice steady, but with an undercurrent of something darker. Daniel stood up, trying to gather his strength. The room seemed smaller now, as if the walls were closing in on him. This was it. This was the moment that could either make or break his entire future. Xena motioned for him to follow. You will come with me to the arena, she instructed. There the trials will begin. You will face challenges that only the bravest of our kind survive. Do not think it will be easy. The arena was unlike anything Daniel had seen before. The grand structure was built into the side of a mountain, with wide stone steps leading down into a massive pit. The seats around the arena were packed with Vaeltheran spectators, their eyes all focused on the human who had dared to enter their world. Daniel felt small under the gaze of so many, but he quickly reminded himself that he wasn't here to be intimidated. He was here to survive. As he stepped into the arena, Cena's voice echoed from above. Your first trial is a test of strength and endurance. You will face a Vaeltheran warrior in combat. He is stronger, faster, and more experienced than you. If you can defeat him, you will move on. If not, her words trailed off, but the implication was clear. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. The warrior Xena referred to was already standing in the center of the arena, tall and broad-shouldered, with glowing blue markings across his body. His eyes were cold, like a predator stalking its prey. Xena continued, her voice loud and clear. Remember, human, this is not just about physical strength. You must outsmart him, as well as fight him. Do not expect mercy from any of us. The gates of the arena clanged shut, trapping Daniel inside with the alien warrior. His heart pounded in his chest, but he took a deep breath. This was his chance to prove himself. He wasn't going to let fear control him. The warrior took a step forward, his weapon, a long curved blade, gleaming in the sunlight. Daniel quickly scanned the arena, looking for anything that could give him an edge. He couldn't beat this guy in raw strength, but he didn't need to. He had to outsmart him. As the warrior charged at him, Daniel braced himself. He wasn't just going to survive this. He was going to win. Daniel ran through the streets of the Vaeltheran city, his feet pounding against the stone pathways. His heart hammered in his chest, but his mind was clear. He had made a choice, and he wasn't going to turn back now. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind him. The soldiers, still in pursuit, their heavy boots thundering as they chased after him. But Daniel wasn't concerned about the speed of their footsteps. He was thinking about the next step. He needed to get out of the palace grounds and find a way to escape, to break free from this alien empire. He dashed down alleyways, his mind working faster than his body could keep up. Xena's betrayal still stung, but there was no time to dwell on it. The soldiers would catch up to him if he didn't move quickly. He couldn't go back to the palace. He couldn't let them control him any longer. As he rounded another corner, Daniel's eyes landed on something that could help. A shuttle, parked just outside a large docking station. It wasn't a military vessel, but it was fast enough for him to escape the city. It was his only chance. Without thinking, he bolted toward the shuttle. The door was still open, and as he jumped inside, Daniel slammed it shut, locking it in place. He quickly took control of the controls, ignoring the flashing warning lights. He had to go now. The engines roared to life as the shuttle took off, blasting through the atmosphere and into space. Daniel didn't even look back as the city grew smaller in the distance. But as the ship broke through the clouds, something changed. His communicator buzzed. A message came through. You can't run forever, human. The voice was unmistakable. It was Xena, but the words were colder than he remembered. She was angry. Daniel tightened his grip on the controls. I'm not running. I'm fighting for my freedom. He knew it wouldn't be that simple. Xena had made it clear that he was a prize, something to be claimed. But he wasn't going to let anyone decide his fate but himself. Ahead of him, the stars shined brightly. His path was open. But behind him, a massive Vaeltheran warship came into view. It wasn't a surprise. Xena had sent everything she had after him. He couldn't outrun them. The warship's cannons powered up, aiming straight at his small shuttle. Daniel's eyes widened. They weren't just going to stop him. They were going to destroy him. In that moment, his thoughts went back to everything he had learned on this alien planet. Survival, cunning, and most importantly, never back down. With a swift motion, Daniel pulled the shuttle into a sharp dive, avoiding the first blast that narrowly missed him. The warship fired again, but he was ready. He darted left, then right, weaving through the asteroid field that lay ahead. The larger ship was too slow to keep up. As the warship tried to follow, Daniel pressed a button on the shuttle's console. The ship's engines roared, and he boosted the power, sending himself into a high-speed spiral toward the planet below. The ship followed, unaware that Daniel had set the ship's course into a self-destruct mode. Daniel wasn't going to wait around for them to catch him. Daniel sat in a cold, dimly lit room, his hands bound loosely behind his back. The stone walls around him were decorated with strange symbols that seemed to shift every time he blinked. His mind raced, still struggling to understand how he had gotten himself into this mess. The chamber was silent, except for the soft hum of the energy shields protecting the palace. How could a simple mistake lead to something like this? He was supposed to be here for diplomatic talks, not to accidentally become part of some alien ritual. He sighed, trying to make sense of Sena's words. The choosing. He had no idea what it was, but it was clear now that he had been caught up in it, and he didn't know if there was a way out. After what felt like hours, the heavy door to the holding room opened. The same guards who had brought him here stepped inside. One of them, a tall alien with sharp green eyes, spoke in a language Daniel couldn't understand. The other guard gave him a look of warning. A moment later, Sena herself entered. Her expression was still unreadable, though there was a flicker of something, regret, in her eyes. Without a word, she motioned for the guards to leave. They hesitated but obeyed, leaving her and Daniel alone in the chamber. Sena's gaze lingered on him, her thoughts clearly at war. I don't know why you're here, human, but you've broken something important, something that cannot be undone easily. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his heart pounding. I didn't mean to. I just... She held up her hand, cutting him off. You didn't know, but that doesn't change what's happened. There was a long pause as Sena stared at him. For a brief moment, Daniel thought he saw a hint of something else in her eyes, something softer. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe even sympathy, but he didn't dare speak. The choosing is not just a ritual. Sena continued, her voice quiet. It is a binding. Once it is chosen, there is no going back. You, Daniel Cross, are now bound to me. Daniel's mind was spinning. Bound. What did she mean by that? Was this some kind of forced marriage? The words felt like a slap to his face. He swallowed hard. Bound to you. Xena nodded. Yes, but it's not as simple as you think. The bond formed is ancient. It cannot be broken unless you prove yourself worthy. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. Worthy? How? She met his eyes. You will undergo the trials. If you survive, then you will be released from this bond. But if you fail... Daniel could see the seriousness in her eyes. The bond was not just about tradition. It was about survival. What happens if I don't survive? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sena's gaze softened, but only for a second. Then the bond remains, and you will be considered my property, human, forever. Daniel's mind raced. The consequences of failing this trial were far worse than he had imagined. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for his freedom. But there was something in Sena's tone that made him think she didn't want that outcome. The question was, could he trust her? For now, all he could do was prepare. When do the trials start? Daniel asked, steeling himself. Sena turned toward the door, her expression unreadable again. Tomorrow. Be ready, human. You may have a chance to prove your worth. Don't waste it. The door shut behind her, leaving Daniel alone once again. The cheers from the crowd were still ringing in his ears as Daniel stepped off the arena floor. His heart was still pounding from the battle, his muscles aching from the sudden exertion. He had survived the first trial, but as he glanced up at the towering walls of the arena, he knew it was far from over. The second trial awaited him. Zaina's voice echoed over the arena, her tone commanding and firm. Prepare yourself, human. The second trial begins now. Before he could even catch his breath, a massive gate at the far side of the arena opened, revealing the next opponent. This time, it wasn't just a warrior. This was a gladiator. The Vale Theron soldier who stepped into the arena was at least 2 feet taller than Daniel, with broad shoulders and muscles that rippled under his armored suit. His face was hidden behind a dark visor, but his gleaming black armor was enough to tell Daniel that this wasn't just a regular fighter. This was elite. The crowd grew quiet, their attention focused on the new challenger. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Daniel's hands instinctively curled into fists, and his heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary fight. Zaina's voice boomed once again, her words sharp and clear. You will face the champion of our warriors. Defeat him, and you will move on. Fail, and you will be bound forever. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The pressure was immense. He had to win. The gladiator moved toward him with slow, deliberate steps, his feet heavy on the ground. He wasn't rushing. He was confident. Daniel, on the other hand, felt the adrenaline course through him, making his mind race. How would he win this fight? The gladiator raised his weapon, an enormous energy axe that crackled with power. Daniel took a deep breath. This wasn't just about strength. It was about outsmarting this massive opponent. The gladiator swung the axe with terrifying force. Daniel barely managed to dodge, his body barely escaping the deadly arc of the blade. The ground where the axe had struck shattered, sending dust and debris flying into the air. Daniel's heart raced. The gladiator was fast, and that weapon was deadly. He couldn't afford to take a hit. The gladiator charged again, this time swinging his axe low in an attempt to knock Daniel off his feet. Daniel jumped just in time, but as he landed, the gladiator was already spinning, aiming the axe directly at him. The force behind it was enough to crush bone, and Daniel had no doubt that one hit would end the fight. But Daniel didn't panic. He moved quickly, his mind working faster than his body. He ducked under the swing, rolling to the side to get out of range. The gladiator's axe slammed into the ground, leaving a deep crack in the stone. Now was his chance. Daniel sprinted toward the gladiator, using his smaller size to his advantage. He ducked under another wild swing of the axe, this time using his momentum to slam into the gladiator's legs, knocking him off balance. The massive warrior stumbled but quickly regained his footing. Daniel didn't hesitate. He had to keep the pressure on. As the gladiator tried to recover, Daniel darted in, using his elbow to strike the weak spot in the gladiator's armor, just under the shoulder guard. The blow was quick and sharp, and the gladiator stumbled back. This was it. With a swift kick, Daniel knocked the gladiator's axe from his hands and pinned him to the ground. The crowd gasped in shock. For a moment, everything went still. Then, the arena erupted into cheers. Daniel had done it. He had won the second trial. Daniel stood over the fallen gladiator, breathing hard, but there was no time to rest. Cena's voice rang out once more. The second trial is over. The human survives. Daniel could barely believe it. He had defeated a warrior who was stronger, faster, and better trained than him. But now, there was only one trial left, the hardest one of all, and he was going to need all his wits and strength to survive it.